conflict. I've been studying sexual conflict for more than 3 decades, actually. Published my first paper on it in 1989, so more than 30 years ago. But no one's really pulled it all together. So there have been bits and pieces on sexual harassment, on the topic of sexual assault, on deception and internet dating, on infidelity and jealousy within marriages and romantic relationships. But no one's put it all together in under the rubric of sexual conflict theory. And that's what this book is primarily about. And although the title is When Men Behave Badly, the Hidden Roots of Sexual Deception, Harassment, and Assault, I also deal with ways in which women behave badly. So it's the coevolution of conflict between males and females, as I will explain. Okay, let me just see if I can forward this. Okay, so I'm sure this is, these gentlemen have made news in Poland because the news has been international, but we have serial sexual harassers and sexual predators, the Harvey Weinstein, Jeffrey Epstein, Bill Cosby, etc. And it won't surprise this audience that there are no women in this group. You never hear about a woman who's sexually harassed or sexually assaulted dozens and dozens of victims. And what I argue in the book is that sexual violence is, in fact, the most widespread human rights problem in the world. I mean, it affects, first of all, 50% of the population. And it occurs in every single culture. So it's not limited to Western cultures. It's not limited to African cultures or Asian cultures. It occurs throughout the world. So the forms of sexual violence are astonishing in their range. So even things like unwanted sexual attention, lewd staring, gaping, non-consensual touching, groping, or kissing, sexual harassment in the workplace, sexual deception, intimate partner violence, which is also a form of sexual conflict because it's designed often by the male to keep the male to be sexually faithful to him and to prevent her from interacting with other men. Stalking, often also by a romantic partner in the aftermath of a breakup, often designed to try to lure the woman back to a mating relationship or to interfere with her from getting involved with other men. Revenge porn is an evolutionarily novel form of sexual conflict. Stranger rape, acquaintance rape, spousal rape, honor killing, sex trafficking. So we have this entire range of forms of sexual violence toward women. And these are very prevalent. I won't go into the actual statistics, but they're all non-trivial percentages of women who are victims of sexual harassment, intimate partner violence. So I mentioned Canada because Canada is one of the more law-abiding and peaceable cultures in the world, but yet 27% of women will experience intimate partner violence at some point during their lifespan. The harms are tremendous, and I talk about these in detail in the book. So becoming a victim of, and I hadn't fully realized this when I started writing the book, but you get into firsthand accounts of the psychological experiences of victims of sexual violence. And then also in our study, a study I published with Karen Perilou and Josh Duntley, where we looked at the harms in the aftermath of sexual assaults or attempted sexual assaults. And these are very, very predictable harms that stem from that: damage to self-esteem, depression, anxiety, eating disorders, post-traumatic stress disorder, impairment of school, work, functioning, social life impairment, and suicidal ideation, and occasionally suicide. Some women kill themselves in the aftermath of a sexual assault. It's rare, but suicidal ideation is not rare. So the harms are extensive. And then moreover, there's what are called secondary victims. And these are rarely considered. So it's not just the primary victim, but also this woman has close friends and work colleagues who care about her, male friends, romantic partners, family members who care about her, a brother, a father, an uncle, a sister, a mother. And then also, even if a woman does not directly experience sexual violence, women often live in fear of sexual violence, especially when it occurs to others. So a woman whose friend is raped or sexually harassed, then she is statistically more likely to also become a victim. And so this creates fear. So my key point is that the damages done by sexual violence toward women are extensive, and they're widespread, and they affect a huge percentage of the population in every culture. Now, from an evolutionary perspective, as I said, sexual violence I view as the most widespread human rights problem in the world. And it's a human rights problem because women should have the right to decide when, where, with whom, and under what circumstances she consents to sex. And as everyone in the audience knows, this is perhaps the first law of mating. That is this freedom of sexual choice. And it comes theoretically from Darwin's theory of sexual selection, where Darwin identified the preferential mate choice and same-sex competition as the two causal processes by which mating success could be achieved. And so the key is in all the details. And we know that this is Darwin 1871, and we know that Trivers provided a major addition or elaboration of sexual selection theory by asking the question, which sex is more likely to do the choosing, and which sex is more likely to compete with members of their own sex for sexual access to desirable members of the opposite sex. And basically it boils down to investment. So in the human case, fertilization occurs internally within women, not within men. Women incur the metabolic and opportunity costs associated with a 9-month pregnancy, subsequent lactation, and these are, in order to produce a single child, in return, men can produce a single child in the minimum case by one act of sex. So we know that that men, we have evolved in our case a menu of mating strategies, including long-term mating strategies. And in long-term mating, when men do the heavy investing, they are also extremely choosy about who they mate with. And so it all boils down to investment, not biological sex per se, except when it comes to this minimum obligatory investment, where women have a much greater minimum obligatory investment compared to men. And so the female mate choice, which occurs in all sexually reproducing species, is what I regard as the first law of mating. And males, unfortunately, attempt to bypass female choice, and that creates sexual conflict. So can an evolutionary perspective help us to identify the causes, context, and underlying psychology of perpetrators and victims? And I think the answer to that is yes. And that's what my book, When Men Behave Badly, is designed to do. That is, we can't engage in what I call sex difference denialism, which is, I don't know if this has reached European countries or Poland specifically, but in the United States and in Canada, there's this movement of sex difference denialism. Also, I know that this is also true in Scandinavian countries, where there's this view that men and women are identical in their evolved sexual psychology or evolved psychology. And some of this sex difference denialism, I think, is well-intentioned, in that people worry that if there are evolved sex differences, then somehow they will be used to discriminate against women. But here we're not talking about issues of cognitive ability or things like that. We're talking about sex differences in our sexual psychology. And those sex differences are evolved, and they're large in magnitude, highly replicable across cultures, and profound. And identifying these causes is critical and the underlying psychology of women and men is critical for eliminating or reducing sexual conflict and sexual violence. So as I'm sure many of you know, sexual conflict started with sexual reproduction, which is not new at all. It evolved, of course, for many billions of years on Earth. There was asexual reproduction, but sexual reproduction evolved about a billion to 2 billion years ago. And once you have the evolution of two sexes, you have the evolution of sexual conflict. This wasn't known in Darwin's time, so it's really a function of our greater understanding of the way that genetics play out and the integration of modern genetics with Darwin's theory of evolution by sexual selection and natural selection. So many of you are familiar with co-evolutionary arms races between species, predators and prey, where for each increment in the speed and agility of a predator, that favors increments in speed and agility of prey. So with cheetahs and impalas or gazelles, the cheetahs that are a little slower, a little less fleet of foot, they basically starve to death. And so in the next generation, the descendant cheetahs are a little faster. And similarly with the impalas or gazelles, the prey organisms, those that are a little less fleet of foot, a little less nimble, a little less wary, a little less vigilant, they get picked off and eaten and die. And so what is left is this co-evolutionary arms race between predators and prey that is ongoing. It's perpetual until physical limits are reached, given, which they sometimes are with predators and prey. And with sexual conflict, there's an analogous co-evolutionary arms race, which is called sexually antagonistic co-evolution. Excuse me, sorry. Sexually antagonistic co-evolution. I'm having problems with my microphone. I'm sorry about that. Let's see if I can stabilize this a little bit. Okay.
We can hear you perfectly clearly. So whatever's happening with the microphone, it's not affecting the quality of the sound.
Okay, very good. Thank you. So we know that sexual conflict theory initiated, you could maybe go to Jeffrey Parker in 1979 as one of the pivotal figures of it, but and Arnquist and Rowe published a whole book on sexual conflict. But most of the species in which sexual conflict has been applied have been insects, spiders, rodents, etc. But it's equally applicable to humans. And this is just an example with a spider where the male spiders give females what are called nuptial gifts. And sometimes the females will grab the gift and run away before copulation. So males have evolved an adaptation to wrap them in silk to increase their mating success, because wrapping them in silk prevents the female from stealing it without copulating. But sometimes when he doesn't have like a delectable dead insect to wrap in the silk, he wraps a piece of random trash to try to fool the female. Females have evolved to detect this trash. And anyway, there's this co-evolutionary arms race between males and females in this particular spider species. So the logic is that there are zones of conflict, what I call zones of conflict. So for example, whenever you have a male optimum that differs from a female optimum on average, then this will create a zone of conflict. So it might be time elapsed before seeking sexual intercourse, where women typically, it's optimal to allow more time to elapse to allow her the opportunity for assessing the man's mate value and his intentions, whether he's pursuing a short-term or long-term mating. Amount of investment before intercourse. Males seem to be perfectly happy in some contexts to have sex with total strangers with no investment. So one classic example is one of my favorite items. This comes from the Gangstead-Simpson sociosexuality inventory. The item is sex without love is okay. And males tend to agree with that statement. Females tend to disagree with that statement on average, but it's a pretty reliable sex difference. Mate value discrepancies. When the man is a 6 and the woman's an 8, there will be a zone of conflict where combined with the fact that men tend to overestimate their attractiveness and desirability to members of the opposite sex. So a man might be a 6, but he thinks he's an 8, and so gets very angry with the woman who's an 8 who rebuffs his advances. And so that's another zone of conflict. So this sexually antagonistic process, male sexual persistence results in the decline of female fitness if it bypasses female choice. Females have evolved resistance adaptations, defenses to prevent becoming a victim of sexual violence. That results in a decline in the fitness of the males pursuing that sexually persistent strategy, again, resulting in this perpetual arms race between the sexes. Now, I've already mentioned the sex differences in reproductive biology, which are many in number. And to an evolutionist, of course, it would be astonishing if humans had not evolved psychological, strategic, and behavioral sex differences that correspond to the different adaptive problems that men and women face, in the mating and sexual domain. So, and of course they have, just as an example, because fertilization occurs internally within women, not within men, the problem of paternity uncertainty, that is a man believing that the offspring are his when they are in fact not, is a problem that men have faced that no woman has. So as far as I know, no woman has ever given birth, and as the child is emerging from her body, she wonders, gee, is this kid really my own? Women are 100% certain, men are always less than 100% certain. This is an example of a sex differentiated adaptive problem that stems from sex differences in our reproductive biology. Sexual conflict, in the book, I talk about 3 temporal contexts in which sexual conflict occurs. So before mating, that is on the mating market. So for example, deception in internet dating, which is very common nowadays, and both sexes engage in deception. They deceive about their mate value, they deceive about their intentions. So for example, on the hookup dating website Tinder, it's estimated that 30% of the men on Tinder are actually married or in long-term committed relationships and are looking for sex on the side. Of course, they don't reveal that information in their dating profiles. Sexual conflict after a mateship is formed. So things like not just sexual infidelity, but what I also discuss is financial infidelity. That's not talked about as much, but when you have pooled resources, one member of the couple can divert those resources toward their fitness interests, if you will, at the cost to their partner. So directing resources toward one set of kin versus another, or men directing their resources to an affair partner rather than to their wife, or women using secret credit cards or bank accounts to purchase items that enhance her mate value at the expense of the pooled resources of the couple. And then of course, conflict in the aftermath of breakup. Often there's an asymmetry where one person wants to break up or get divorced and another person does not. And so that's where you have intimate partner violence and stalking that comes into the equation, forms of sexual violence. Sometimes physical violence within relationships, people don't think about that as sexual violence, but it is sexual violence, I argue, because it basically is an attempt to bypass female choice. It's an attempt to keep the female locked in a relationship where it might be advantageous for her to leave that relationship. So evolved sex differences that produce sexual conflict. They are many in number, and I'll just highlight a few of them here. And those who are interested can check out my book, which, by the way, is I'm very happy that Poland has translated almost all of my books into Polish. Now, my current book, When Men Behave Badly, has it's contracted to be translated, so it's being translated right now as we speak, but it is not yet out in Poland in Polish. But my other books are, and I'm hoping that the Polish translation will be out in Poland soon. Desire for sexual variety. I think this is one of the things that produces the most conflict between the sexes. We know that these are very large. So how many sex partners do you desire? Well, we know men desire a larger number than women. This is true in every culture. My former colleague, David Schmidt, former student of mine who's now an eminent professor at Brunel University, has done a study of more than 50 different cultures and showed that this desire for sexual variety is universal, every culture. Time elapsed, people are seeking sex, sexual fantasies. Men do more partner switching in their sexual fantasies. They have more frequent sexual fantasies. They have more sexual fantasies about a wider variety of sex partners. Patronage of prostitutes. Almost all the patrons are men and not women. Can men and women be just friends? Well, men have more difficulty. They can, but men have more difficulty because they're more likely to become romantically or sexually attracted to their opposite sex friend. And when that attraction is not reciprocated, it causes conflict in that friendship. And this is one of my, I was gonna say one of my favorite, but not my favorite, but a kind of a disturbing sex difference. Could you enjoy having sex with someone that you hated? Well, women almost invariably say absolutely not. But men, if the woman's attractive, even if they dislike her intensely, they don't seem to have a problem having sex with her. So likelihood of consenting to sex after X amount of time, again, as you can see, this is from 5 years to 1 hour, enormous sex differences. These are not, the usual effect sizes in psychology, which are Ds of 0.2, 0.3. These are enormous magnitude effect sex differences with Ds of 0.8 or 1.0. That is a full standard deviation or sometimes more of sex differences. So I'm sure many of you are aware of the replication crisis in psychology and the social sciences more generally. But in this domain, these are highly replicable. And I know of no cases where they haven't been replicated. Number of partners desired, I've already mentioned that. This is data from David Frederick, who did a wonderful, massive study on that, and just shows massive sex difference in desire for sexual variety, how many partners you want, what is your minimum, what's your ideal, what's your maximum, etc. Men are more likely than women to overestimate their attractiveness. And interestingly, and this is something that I didn't know until I started digging into the research, these aren't my data, but that men on average find women to be more attractive than women find men. And what this means is in the online dating sites, that the top 20% of the men get almost all of the attention from women, which means that 80% of the men don't. This often creates bitterness. And so I'm sure you have heard of the rage of the incels being an acronym for involuntarily celibate males. And men get very angry when they are rebuffed by women or cannot gain sexual access to women. I mean, it is the cause of some forms of killing. For example, the Isla Vista killer, who wrote in his manifesto before he killed 6 people, that ever since he hit puberty, he's been wanting to have sex with women, and they show absolutely no interest in him, and they get very angry about it. But this difference, the fact that men find many more women to be sexually attractive than women find men, is another really interesting sex difference that creates sexual conflict. We know men lower their standards in short-term mating. Women tend not to. Women maintain very high standards. For example, this is data from Kenrick about minimum percentiles that would be acceptable for a date or casual sex or a marriage partner. And both men and women maintain pretty high standards for committed relationships, as you can see. But it's when it comes to casual sex, men drop their standards to embarrassing levels. So a woman only has to be in the 40th percentile in intelligence to be acceptable or over threshold. Male sexual overperception bias. This, I first talked about this in my book, The Evolution of Desire. Marty Hazelton and I, in the year 2000, so it's 21 years ago, developed what we call error management theory, where we hypothesize that when there's a cost asymmetry between two types of errors, sexual selection will favor adaptations to minimize the more costly errors. And so we had hypothesized that the male sexual overperception bias was one of these error management biases, where sexual and reproductive opportunities were very rare and very valuable to men ancestrally, and missing out on the sexual opportunity would be very costly, more costly than falsely inferring that the woman might be sexually interested when she's not. So the classic case is woman smiles at a man thinks, oh, she's romantically or sexually interested in me. Woman might think, no, I'm just being friendly or polite or even nervous if the guy's a little creepy. So men tend to over-infer sexual interest when it's not there. Interestingly, we also found in our laboratory study, this is Karen Perilou and Jamie Comfort, where we had a kind of like a speed dating setup in the laboratory, that women underestimated the sexual interest of the men that they interacted with. That is, men are saying, yes, I'm interested in her, and women are not picking up on that. And so I develop in the book a couple hypotheses which are as yet untested about why women would underperceive men's sexual interest. Could be an evolved defense, but at any rate, I'll push on here. Importantly, not all men do this. So that is, men who are most susceptible to the sexual overperception bias are high on narcissism. That is, they think they're hot when they're not. They think they're more intelligent, attractive, and desirable than they actually are. And men who are high on the SOI, sociosexual inventory, that is, men who are pursuing a short-term mating strategy. It is these men who are most likely to commit the sexual overperception bias or be susceptible to it, likely as a design feature to facilitate the success of a short-term mating strategy. If you think that no women are interested in you, you're not going to be very successful as a short-term mater. But if you think that you're God's gift to women, that's going to increase probability of success because you will make more mating attempts. Another set of studies that find that men are attracted to sexually exploitable women, not as long-term mates, importantly, but as short-term mates. And we've identified with former graduate students, Carrie Getz, Judy Easton, and David Lewis, identified exploitability cues. So if the woman is intoxicated or seems incapacitated, sleepy, gullible, low cognitive capacity, if she doesn't seem too bright, if she's young, young, immature, inexperienced, seems gullible, revealing or provocative clothing, and importantly, lacking bodyguards. This is one of those domains in which there's a large discrepancy, I think, between ancestral and modern environments, where women often were surrounded by close kin, brothers, mothers, sisters, aunts, friends, and allies, whose mere presence could deter a potential sexual predator. But if the woman lacks bodyguards, as they often do, for example, on college campuses, that makes them more vulnerable. They're perceived as more sexually exploitable. And again, only some men are attracted to sexually exploitable women. Again, men pursuing a short-term mating strategy, and men high on the dark triad personality traits of narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy. That is, narcissism, this sense of grandiosity and sense of entitlement, including sexual entitlement. Machiavellianism is those who score high pursue an exploitative mating strategy and social strategy more generally. These are the liars, the cheaters, the deceivers. And psychopathy, those who have no empathy to the suffering of other individuals, including the women that they assault. So another sex difference. So how harassing are these actions? Staring at her chest while talking to her, asking her if she would take off her clothes, etc. Told about it, leering at her as she walked by. Women in our studies perceive these same acts as more sexually harassing than men do, and they perceive them as more upsetting than the same actions that would be perpetrated on a man. And this sex difference is actually really important for sexual harassment policies. So this is just an example where in real life, a supermarket chain, this is within the United States, developed what they called superior customer service. They instructed their clerks to smile and make eye contact with the customers in the checkout line. And this led to requests for dates, sexual propositions, and in some cases, stalking. And so the women filed sexual harassment lawsuits, and because they were being harassed. Again, that triggering the smiles and friendliness, triggering the male sexual overperception bias. So they ended up eliminating this policy, the superior customer service policy, and then it dramatically reduced the rates of sexual harassment of the workers. Work by Decker Keltner out of Berkeley and others has shown that when men attain a position of status and power, they feel a sense of sexual entitlement. And also they overestimate their attractiveness to women and feel lower empathy for the victims. So when people attain status, that seems to decrease their empathy for victims, which is a rather disturbing phenomenon. Again, which men are sexually harassers? Most men are not. Most men find sexual harassment to be morally abhorrent or unethical. And so it's a subset of men who are serial sexual harassers. Again, short-term mating strategy combined with the high dark triad qualities. So, these are some elements of the sexual psychology of perpetrators of sexual violence, and they apply to different forms of sexual harassment and sexual coercion more generally. They don't necessarily apply to stalking in the aftermath of breakups. So in stalking in the aftermath of breakups, there's a different constellation of characteristics. So in my book, I devote a whole chapter to stalking and the qualities of the men. And often these are men who are they're lower in mate value. They tend to be on the autism spectrum side of things, which more men are than women. And so they lack good cross-sex mind reading skills and abilities. So, but at any rate, those who are interested in stalking, we have developed a website, Josh Duntley and I, to help victims of stalking and to give the best advice we can about what to do about it. And so I devote a whole chapter in the book to stalking, the psychology of stalkers, and then what women can do, which tactics are effective in combating stalkers and which are not effective. So when it comes to sexual violence, I also devote a whole chapter to women's defenses against sexual violence, because based on what we know about sexual conflict theory, if there are adaptations in males to bypass female choice, that's going to select for adaptations in women to prevent that choice from being bypassed, and so that women can preserve their choice. And so I identify 12 different defenses that women have either evolved or developed. I mean, some of these things might be culturally evolved, but I think some of them are absolutely genetically evolved defenses to prevent sexual violence. And I talk about them again in 3 temporal contexts. So defenses to prevent becoming a victim of sexual coercion, defenses to combat a sexual assault while it is happening or while it is attempted by the male, and then defenses in the aftermath of a sexual assault to minimize the damage that a woman incurs as a result of that sexual assault. And so I don't have time to go into the details of these dozen defenses, but I'll just mention a couple for those who might be interested in them. So bodyguards, as I've already mentioned, this has been a key defense for women male bodyguards, partners sometimes, but also male friends, female friends, allies, even the fact that women go at a restaurant, they'll go to the bathroom in couples or rather than alone. Males tend to go to the bathroom or the WC by themselves. Women say to their friend, would you like to go to the WC with me? And they're not, as far as I know, engaging in nefarious activities, but it could be, one hypothesis is they're keeping a bodyguard with them, or also probably exchanging information about the men that they're with. Specialized fears of strange males. So women have an inordinate, not inordinate, but it's, I think, quite adaptive. I think it's an error management bias towards strange males. And so I talk about this in the book where women, this is one context where women over-infer the sexual intentions of strange males, where they view the strange male, especially if the woman is alone without bodyguards, as a potential sexual assaulter. Alarm calling during the occurrence of an attempted sexual assault, fighting, kicking, screaming, and so forth. Here's another important one, tonic immobility. And this occurs in prey species, in predator-prey interactions. Sometimes the prey has an adaptation to become tonically immobile. And it's like freezing, except it's not like freezing in that when you freeze, you're still aware of what's going on around you. Tonic immobility is an involuntary reaction where in the context in which it occurs, and this occurs in something like 40% of rape victims, where the woman feels an intense level of fear combined with a sense of entrapment. That is, she is entrapped and there are no avenues for escape. She will experience this tonic immobility where her body literally, she can't move her muscles. And the reason this is important is because sometimes women are blamed for being sexually assaulted by people who say, well, why didn't you do more to fight him off? And sometimes they blame themselves. They think, why didn't I fight him off more? Well, this adaptation or hypothesized adaptation of tonic immobility, knowledge of that, knowledge of the fact that it's evolved and an involuntary response, I hope will be used to prevent blaming women in those circumstances and also prevent self-blame and the guilt women experience in the aftermath of a sexual assault. The fact that rape is perhaps the most underreported crime of all, they estimate perhaps 75% of all rapes are not reported. And part of the reason is that concealment, I think, is an adaptive response to prevent continued damage in the aftermath of the assault. So damage to her reputation, damage to her social alliances, damage to her perceived mate value, and others. And I go into that in some detail. And then, of course, seeking refuge. Sometimes women experience PTSD. It's regarded as a disorder by the mainstream, but from an evolutionary perspective, PTSD might not be a disorder at all. It might be an adaptive response there. The woman's brain telling her, don't go out over that hill again, or don't go walking down that street again, because it's a situation that might be dangerous to her. And so I think an adaptationist perspective sheds light on and illuminates these defenses that women either have evolved or developed or have acquired culturally. And in the book, I talk about which ones are effective and also which ones are not so effective. So it's a very useful source of information for women and the people who care about them. So suggestions for reducing sexual conflict. First, mind the gap. And this is the last chapter of the book that I talk about this issue in detail. This sex difference denialism that I talked about earlier, I think is really problematic. That is, denying that there are sex differences in our evolved sexual psychology harms precisely the 50% of the population around the earth that is most likely to become a victim of sexual violence. And so I think we have to acknowledge that in the mating domain, in the domain of sexual psychology, there are huge sex differences, and these create conflict, and they have evolved in part because of these recurrent sexually antagonistic co-evolutionary processes. So we have to acknowledge them and identify them because they're key parts of the causes. And if you don't identify the causes, you're not going to have effective intervention attempts to eliminate sexual violence. In many ways, we're stuck in the interiors of our own brains. That is, we have access to our own sexual psychology, at least to some extent, but we don't really know what's going on in the domain of the other. And so if we use as a default our own sexual psychology to infer the sexual psychology of the opposite sex, we're going to make very predictable sorts of errors. So one is the sexual misperception bias, where men who experience this, they find themselves sexually attracted to a woman, and they can't imagine that the woman does not reciprocate that attraction to them. And then another one, and this is an evolutionarily modern form of phenomena, is sending what are called colloquially dick pics, or unwanted sexual images, where in male sexual psychology, they find images of a woman's naked breasts or genitals to be sexually arousing. And they think, oh, well, the woman will find pictures of my genitals sexually arousing, and they don't, typically. So the women's studies of women's exposure to these unwanted images, women's most common reaction is gross. This is disgusting. They don't find them typically attractive or arousing at all. So I think knowledge of these, and then sometimes erroneously believe that women will find them attractive, and they don't. So I think knowledge of these sex differences is critical, and one step, an important step toward reducing sexual conflict. Second, sexual harassment codes and stalking laws are often written according to what's called the reasonable person standard. Would a reasonable person view this pattern of conduct to be sexually harassing or to invoke fear in a victim of stalking? And the problem is that studies in my lab and others find that, that women view that same pattern of sexual harassment and same pattern of stalking to be more harassing and more upsetting and more fear-inducing than men do. And so what this means is that if the judge or jury is composed of reasonable men, then that will result in a different outcome of that than if it's composed of reasonable women. And so I even think that knowledge of these evolved sex differences has consequences for our policies and laws around things like stalking and sexual harassment. 3, recognition of individual differences. It's not all men and it's not all women. They're profound, and we now know what at least some of the important individual differences are, such as dark triad personality traits and individual differences in the pursuit of a short-term mating strategy. And so we really have to combine an evolutionary perspective with an understanding of individual differences in the mating strategies and personality characteristics of individuals in the equation. So treating all men and all women with the same brush doesn't do the trick. We need to understand these individual differences. 4th, mismatches between ancestral and modern environments. These create some adaptive problems while reducing others. So I've already kind of alluded to one where we evolved in the context of where women had bodyguards. And so in the modern environment, women often go off to college or university many, many miles away from their friendship networks, their extended kin, and so they often lack bodyguards. And they often will lack, especially freshman women in their first year of college or university, they lack the knowledge and experience to deal with this evolutionarily unprecedented social context. And so that's why freshman women in their first year of university are roughly twice as likely to become victims of sexual violence as women who are at the later stages of their university careers. And so these mismatches create some problems, and they reduce others. So like one is ancestrally, we would have had access to only perhaps a dozen or 2 dozen potential mates in our entire lifespan. Whereas in the modern world with internet dating, this gives us access to thousands or millions of potential mates that we would have never encountered in our day-to-day existence. So that might be a good thing, but the internet dating also creates opportunities for sexual predators that didn't exist previously. So technologies like internet dating can help with some things, but also cause harm in other ways. And then finally, we have to recognize that men and women must join forces and cooperate to reduce sexual violence. So it's not all men against all women. Men are not united in their interests in oppressing women. From an evolutionary perspective, that view of men united in their interest in oppressing women is incoherent, precisely because we know that every woman has a father, brothers, uncles, male friends, romantic partners who care about them and their welfare. And so men are allied with women, with some other women, and they're in competition and conflict with men, with other men for access to those women. And similarly, women are allied with some men and in conflict with other men. So we really need an evolutionary perspective to understand this point, and that these serial sexual coercers and serial sexual harassers, they are harmful not just to the women primary victims, but they're also harmful to the secondary victims. That is, all the people who care deeply about or are involved with these women who then become victims. And so I think cooperation between the sexes, between men and women, is critical for reducing sexual violence. Final point, education about evolved sex differences, I guess I made this point, is critical, and that you can't use introspection about your own sexual psychology to infer the sexual psychology of the opposite sex. Again, sexual violence against women, I think, is the most widespread human rights problem in the world. And an evolutionary perspective, I think, can not only help, I think it's indispensable for reducing sexual violence against women. So for those who are interested, I hope you check out my book on the topic of sexual conflict, When Men Behave Badly, The Hidden Roots of Sexual Deception, Harassment, and Assault. And thank you for your attention, and I'd be more than welcome to take questions or hear points that you might have. And I'm gonna allow Conrad to identify people who have questions or points to make.
Right, thank you, David. Very thorough. So please, everyone, questions.
Hello, are there?
All right. Well, if nobody's asking questions, there's oh, I can see already. Just as I was about to ask a question, I can see two people have put up their hands. Bogusz.
Hi, David. Thanks for the talk. As you remember, we tried to invite you for a couple of years, and finally you are with us, although not in person. That's a great pity.
Yeah, but that will happen. Conrad assures me that he will invite me again, and I very much look forward to being there in person.
Yeah, maybe it will happen soon. Thanks once more. I was wondering about the evolutionary reasons. I agree with you, but don't you think that all these problems we've got right now in modern societies or weird societies is not related with the fact that in small-scale societies, in some religions, like in Islam, they usually use these protections, different kind of ways they protect women against any type of harassment. There is not a big problem in that situation. So it is kind of naturally implemented in different cultures. And only in our societies, which is related with, you know, new environment, social environment, new opportunities, it became so problematic and it became a big problem. So basically, we do not need to put any evolutionary reasons for that, because basically in the past, it was not a big problem. What do you think about this?
Yeah, well, I think it was a different set of problems. So, so if you go back, if you look at the ethnographic record, look at the ethnographies that have been written by anthropologists over the last 150 years or so, it's clear that sexual violence does occur in hunter-gatherer cultures and has occurred. The other thing is ancestrally, you have intergroup warfare. And I think intergroup warfare, so for example, like with the Yanomamo, when Napoleon Shagan asked the Yanomamo, why do you go to war? And they say, well, obviously to capture women or to recapture women that have been stolen from you. And so I think a lot of the rapes, sexual assaults, kidnapping of women was a recurrent feature of small intergroup warfare over evolutionary time. So very different context. But you mentioned Islamic cultures where women are heavily guarded, and so preventing certain forms of sexual conflict, but create opportunities for others. So in some Muslim cultures, for example, there's polygyny, where one man will have up to 4 wives. Well, if one man has 4 wives, then that means 3 men have 0 wives, assuming an equal sex ratio. And there's some evidence that when there's a surplus of young unmated men in the mating pool, that rape rates increase. And so yes, women are heavily guarded in in those cultures, but they're heavily guarded in part because they might be more vulnerable to sexual violence. So I think, and you could even regard in some of these cultures, women are married at a very early age and then heavily guarded and locked away. You could regard that also as a form of bypassing female choice. So, so I agree with your general point that as I understand it, that different cultural contexts are going to alter the cost-benefit matrix of sexual conflict and its forms and how it plays out. But I think that you know, we have to view these as, if you will, cultural vectors that influence the arenas in which sexual conflict plays out.
Thanks a lot. I wanted just to mention the last studies. They were conducted 2 years ago at the end of our conference. And the reason I waited with the question was that during the studies, they found that if a female takes the first voice when asking the question, more women are more likely to ask other questions. But if a man asks the question first, so less women ask questions later. This, by the way.
With regards to that, we actually have 3 written comments by women. So I'll read them out to you, David, and ask you to respond to them. The first one from Barbara Borkowska. Please use the term sex workers instead of prostitutes. That's how they usually prefer to be called.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. I usually refer to them as sex workers, although interestingly, there was a new New York Times article that just appeared a couple of days ago by a woman named Catherine McKinnon, who argues that they shouldn't be called sex workers because she argues that it's not sex, because she argues that sex is really defined by women as something that occurs in the context of a romantic or emotional relationship. And she argues that it's not work, that it's basically forced labor rather than actual work. And so she objects to the term sex worker. So I'm happy to use the term sex worker myself, but that term itself is coming under fire by some individuals.
Okay, second comment by Alexandra Shemkov. Thank you very much, David. Your book is fantastic and important. We can't wait for the Polish version as well.
Thank you.
And the third comment by Anna Chmielnicka. David, with what reason would you explain the difference between men and women in empathic understanding about what could be attractive to the opposite sex? Women, I think, tend to know what could be interesting for men. Why men do not know this, which results in sending unwanted sexual images?
Yeah, well, I think that it's a great question, and you know, I don't have all the answers, so what I'll do is just speculate a little. One is, I think that we have evolved emotions, sex differences and evolved emotions, and I mentioned one of them, like disgust. Well, there are sex differences in sexual disgust, and most men are not aware that that women don't experience sexual disgust in the same way that men do. So even when it comes to issues of sexual attraction, men tend to be primarily visual organisms and use visual input as the predominant form of information, whereas women use a wider variety of their senses, including olfactory cues. I think it's also kind of what I alluded to earlier, that you know, it is true. That's one of the other sex differences, that women are more empathic than men. And so women, at least in these contexts, sexual and mating contexts, might have superior mind reading ability. So that is, they might make fewer errors in cross-sex mind reading compared to men as a result of their greater empathy. I mean, empathy is related to accuracy at cross-sex mind reading. So I think that the answer to this excellent question is there are probably a variety of evolved mechanisms that are involved in the sex difference in ability to correctly infer the sexual psychology of the opposite sex.
All right. Michał Player, you have a question. Sorry, Michael Player, you have a question.
Yeah, okay, thanks a lot. I was wondering about your, I think it was point 4 of your conclusion, where you talked about like that our evolved psychological dispositions can lead to like certain disadvantages and advantages according to context. And one of them you mentioned was that women had bodyguards kind of in the environment where they, you know, evolved psychologically, and now when they go to places like university, then they're not equipped to deal with some of the dangers there. My question here is a bit matter of emphasis, because if somebody kind of was very critical, they would say that sounds a bit like victim blaming in the guise of evolutionary psychology. So I was wondering if kind of in matters of emphasis, you would say that there are spaces where basically you then have to look at what are the dispositions of women, what are the dispositions of men, and of the kind of social environment, and how can we kind of focus how we change the dispositions and the equippedness both of men and women and kind of the social situation.
Oh, absolutely. You know, I mean, I think that, you know, education about the evolved sex differences in our sexual psychology is critical for identifying the social circumstances that are most likely to reduce it. So just as an example, you know, so I've been looking into this. At our university, we have freshman orientation where they provide information to men and women about issues like sexual assault on college campuses and so forth. But often this information is not informed by scientific evidence about our evolved psychology and the social circumstances that are most likely to activate that psychology as opposed to inhibiting that psychology. So, for example, just because men have if I understand your question correctly, that you think the emphasis should be on social conditions, and I totally agree with that. Even things like changing the policy around sexual harassment. So at my university, for example, there's been a recent change in the policy of sexual harassment where a victim of sexual harassment, it used to be that it was incumbent upon the woman to report the sexual harassment. But my university now requires that anyone who observes sexual harassment in the university is required to report it. Otherwise, you can actually be fired if you don't, if you're an employee of the university. And so what this does is, you know, the policy might have advantages and disadvantages, but one of the advantages is that it means it takes the burden off of the sole shoulders of the woman victim and makes more people responsible for combating sexual harassment. And I think that these policies have and will result in changes even in social norms. So, you know, is it acceptable to sexually harass or to touch a woman, you know, inappropriately in a work context? Well, it used to be much more appropriate than it is now. And so with these policies, it basically puts everybody on guard. Now, what you hope is that it doesn't have a chilling effect such that, you know, people stop interacting with members of the opposite sex, which would defeat the whole purpose of, you know, education and university settings. But it's an example of a policy where you change a social circumstance that influences the evolved psychology of men and women. And I think that another point is that we do have an evolved psychology around status and reputation. And men are very, very sensitive, as women are, to their status and reputation. And so if you change, you know, the ingredients of what can harm your status and reputation, then that will cause men to inhibit some of the desires that they might otherwise act upon.
All right, thank you.
Okay, Piotr, you've been waiting for a while.
Yes.
So.
Okay, thanks for a great presentation. And I have a question regarding online world and how, what is your opinion, how online environment differs from offline environment? So the kind of behaviors like sexting or cyber stalking, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, well, it's a really interesting question. And, you know, all I can do is offer some speculations here because it's an ever-changing world. So even things like revenge porn, that is a spurned romantic partner posting photographs on these sites of their naked photographs of their ex in order to harm them or seek revenge on them for rejecting them. These are evolutionarily modern phenomena. I think, you know, some of the obvious things are that in the cyber world, this creates the opportunity for cyber stalking in a way that is evolutionarily unprecedented. I think that the change, the abundance of access to potential mates in internet dating has created opportunities for sexual predators and greater choice of potential mates, but also what is sometimes called decision paralysis. That is, if you have so many potential partners to choose from, people sometimes think, oh, there's someone who's just a little bit better right around the corner, and so I'll reject this one. And so it creates decision paralysis. And there's evidence now in both Europe and North America that rates of marriage and rates even of sexuality, in real life sexuality, have been going down. And so I think these forms of internet technology might be having a profound effect, even in terms of reproduction. So many countries are now have birth rates that are below replacement levels. And so we're living in this crazy modern world where the effects of these internet technologies are not fully known. They're not well studied, but we know they're having an impact. So anyway, those are just a couple speculations What are your thoughts? Do you have any insights into your
so
question?
for example, we examined cyber stalking, and we found that women in long-term relationships perpetrate cyber stalking more. Yeah. But on the other hand, we know that traditional stalking is perpetrated by men. So this is some new situation we discover.
Yes.
Of course. Yeah.
Well, my guess is that the women are using it to obtain information.
Yeah. Exactly.
About their partner. Is my partner cheating on me, you know, et cetera. And men, you also use it for information, but the key element of at least stalking laws in the United States is they have to, the pattern of behavior has to result in a fear of the victim. And so if the victim doesn't experience fear, then it doesn't qualify legally as stalking. And we know that the same pattern of conduct by a woman doesn't evoke the same level of fear in the man as the pattern does in a woman. And so I guess what I would say is we need a more fine-grained analysis of that issue of what is the purpose of the stalking. Is it information gathering, or is it an attempt to interfere with the mating relationships of the former partner or current partner and or to remate?
Exactly.
Okay, we're running a little bit over time, but I just wanted to read the remarks that are on the chat. So Jacek Wiewiórowski wrote, as a legal historian, I agree with David and Contra Bogusz. Historical record is full of the examples of sexual assaults and harassments made by men. The problem seems to be a universal phenomenon, and it's not connected with weird societies. And on the same issue, Peter Jonathan wrote, the issue is about whether it was common enough to act as an ancestral selection pressure. David, you want to?
Well, I think that in answer to Peter's question, absolutely. I mean, I think the evidence is overwhelming that sexual conflict and sexual violence of the forms that I was describing has a long and deep history, because if you go back to written records, as far as written records go back, there sexual conflict and sexual assaults in all the ethnographies, not all, but in a lot of them, sexual conflict. Intergroup warfare, as I mentioned, even if you look at the molecular genetic evidence, there's basically evidence of that. So what I call, or sometimes it's called the Genghis Khan effect, where you have clear molecular genetic evidence of invading populations, killing the males, and then mating with the females, who basically are sexual captors, if you will. And so if you look at the convergent evidence across multiple data sources, psychological, ethnographic, historical written records, paleontological, et cetera, if you look at the convergent evidence across all these different data sources, they point to a long and deep history of sexual conflict of the forms that I've been describing.
Right.
Yeah, I agree. I was posing a rhetorical point in the chat. I'm with you.
Okay, cool.
Good to see you.
All right, and final question from Monika Boruta. How do you think the reaction towards violence, so reporting stalking, harassment, domestic violence, and rape, change in the coming generations of young people? The Me Too campaign hit very hard some time ago, but also one can observe a feminist, equalist wave that has been promoted by young people around the globe very much.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's grounds for optimism for reducing these forms of sexual conflict. So rape rates have gone down, at least in Western cultures over the years. I think rates of sexual harassment have also gone down. Rates of intimate partner violence have gone down, except they started to spike again during the pandemic, where people who are on the verge of breaking up are basically in lockdown with an abusive partner. So there's evidence that intimate partner violence has spiked during the pandemic, but hopefully that will go down as well. With respect to the influence of feminist positions, of course, feminism, there's a whole spectrum of feminist positions, and many of which disagree with each other. But I think that the importance of feminist perspectives will be increased or amplified if they embrace evolutionary psychology and acknowledge and study the sex differences in our evolved sexual psychology. I think that those ideologies that promulgate the notion that there are no evolved sex differences is actually very destructive to women and counterproductive. And I don't know if this is true in Poland, but in the United States, in gender studies courses or whatever, there's a great antipathy and opposition to evolutionary perspectives. Of course, most of these are caricatured and misunderstood and not well understood, but they're objected to. And I think that the rejection of an evolutionary perspective is very harmful. And so fortunately, so there are Darwinian feminists. So even within the Human Behavior and Evolution Society, there's a subgroup of Darwinian feminists, and I think they are important in leading the way toward a more informed feminist perspective.
Would you agree with, if I may, sorry, just on that very last point, right? Would you agree that the rejection of the idea that there are evolved differences between males and females is due to the way in which supposed differences between men and women, where those differences were not even necessarily based on actual scientific understanding of what's going on, were used to try and maintain the kinds of issues that, the kinds of approaches, the kinds of problems that you are pointing out here. So in fact, what you had was bad pseudoscience, which was,
and there's no question about it. I mean, there has been a history of misperceptions of sex differences, for example, in cognitive ability that have resulted in discrimination against women. So I know of one concrete example, and this occurred a while back. But I've been in academia a while back. So a female friend of mine who is a professor, she was told that she was not going to get as high a pay raise as another professor who was at the same rank, because the chair of the department told her that she had a husband who had a job, whereas this other professor was the male who was the sole supporter of his family. Well, this is something that probably would not possibly occur today. But my point is that I'm in agreement that bad science and misperceptions of what the sex differences are, especially in the domain of abilities, has been misused to discriminate against women. And I think that we need to call that out and defend against that misuse. But in this case, in the domain of sexual psychology, as I mentioned, we're not talking about differences in abilities, we're talking about differences in sexual and mating psychology. And those are critical for eliminating the forms of sexual violence that we see today.
Yes, of course. Well, David, thank you very much. That has been fascinating.
Thank you.
Now, this is the very last presentation for the day. Now, I don't know, David, if you have the time, but we actually have informal social exchange, which is on in electronic format, of course. What we have is a platform called GatherTown, where a lot of people have been gathering. after the formal parts of the conference. So if you have the time and the energy, we would welcome you to drop around GatherTown to say hello informally to.
Sure. Yeah, I would be delighted to. So how do I do that?
I have put the link in the chat. All you have to do is click on the link and then enter the password, and then you create your own avatar to appear in the space.
Okay, so clicking on the link. So I have to pick an avatar.
Yes.
Okay, I don't know what these symbols mean here. Yeah. Okay, I guess I'll pick this guy here. Next step, enter my name.
Before you go in, you'll have to mute your microphone in Zoom, because if you have your mic on both in Zoom and in GatherTown, we get really bad feedback.
Okay, so I'll eliminate that. I've disconnected the microphone.
We can